So good morning. Good morning to our guest, Dr. Ocampo. Good morning to everybody who has taken time today to come and hear this. We're very excited to have you join us as part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Awareness Month activities. And so I do, for the folks who are in the audience, I'd like to just read through your bio if you'll forgive me for this one. So if you're ready. Dr. Anthony Campo is a scholar and writer who focuses on issues of immigration, race and ethnicity, and gender and sexuality. He is the author of The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race, recently featured on NPR Morning Edition. His book examines the racial lives of Filipino Americans who trace their roots to a society in Asia, but also share many cultural characteristics with Latinos. The Latinos of Asia raises the puzzle. Are Filipinos in the United States becoming Asian American or Latino? Dr. Ocampo draws on the voices of Filipino Americans to demonstrate how demographic shifts in the US are changing the way immigrants and children understand race. His book also provides a foreshadowing of what race relations in America will look like as our society moves further away from the Black-white racial paradigm. Dr. Ocampo has also co-edited two major collections in race and ethnic studies, Contemporary Asian America, a multidisciplinary reader, and Asian American Society, an encyclopedia. Beyond his scholarly writings, he has also been featured as a commentator for local and national news outlets, including CNN, 60 Minutes, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Dr. Ocampo also has a regular segment on all things Phil-Am with Dr. O on Kababayan Today, a daily talk show for and about Filipino Americans. He is a native Los Angelino and is a graduate of Stanford University and the University of California, Los Angeles. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Ocampo and turn it over to you.
Thank you, everybody at Clovis Community College. I feel like it's been a long time coming because originally I was slated, Patrick and I were just talking about how I was slated to be there exactly 1 year ago, if I'm not mistaken, right, Patrick? Yeah. And so I'm just really glad that I'm able to come here. And even though it's a little bit, it's a years away from when it was originally scheduled, it just means so much to be here speaking to a community in the Central Valley at this particular moment for a lot of reasons. Number one, I think that more than ever, when you flip on the news or when you see what's happening in this country, we all know that hate crimes against Asian Americans, particularly the elderly, particularly women, have been on the upswing in ways that just seem unfathomable to a lot of us. This idea that people can enact violence and hate verbally, physically, to folks that are just going about their everyday to enact this violence randomly, it just seems like the most disgusting thing in the world to be witnessing. Um, we know that hate crimes are on the upswing. And even though we've been seeing a lot of this violence against Asian Americans on the news in all different parts of the country, I think that the fact that it's probably a lot of our first time seeing Asian American anti-Asian violence on the news, it may hint at the idea that this is a new thing. But if there's anything that we know from activists, organizers, academics that are actually from the Central Valley and the surrounding areas, we know that violence against Asian Americans, violence against Filipino Americans has actually been a very long-standing phenomenon dating back to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, to the Philippine American War, to the Korean War, to the Vietnam War, to the bombing of Southeast Asia, to the ongoing presence of military, to Japanese internment, to post 9/11 violence against our South Asian siblings. And so even though it's probably, we often think about anti-Asian violence as linked to, the hateful rhetoric, things like about the coronavirus and its links to China. I would rather not repeat it here. It's actually been a very long-standing phenomenon that violence against Asian people, not just in the United States, but abroad, has been happening within context of United States history for a very long time. So I'm just super glad that your leaders at your particular institution are choosing to censor Asian American experiences, because it really underscores how much they value the importance of talking about that history and talking about that phenomenon in a way that shows that it's a central part to our society today. I deliberately wore this T-shirt. It says "Don Mabalan is in the heart" because this was the only reason I ever became a writer and an academic, is because of this woman right here, Dr. Don Mabalan, who is from Stockton, California. I don't know if anyone here is from Stockton, California, but she grew up in Stockton. She herself grew up around organizers, Filipino and Mexican farm workers in the Central Valley. She had direct ties to those activist movements. And then after, was emboldened to write about these issues as a journalist, ended up pursuing her community college degree before going on to UCLA, and then ended up doing her PhD at Stanford University. And in my first year of college, when I was feeling the most lost, it was someone that had links to the Central Valley that really helped me find my way. So I kind of see today as a little bit of a homecoming, because so much of Filipino American studies and Filipino American history, Asian American studies, actually traces its roots to all of the activism that's happened in the Central Valley. And so I just wanted to say that out loud, because I think that it's not often that people pay their, like, they don't cite the brilliance and the intellectual work that has happened in the Central Valley when thinking about these broader ethnic studies movements. So this is my like opening thank you. So I want to just share my screen, if that's okay. I have my PowerPoint, and I just wanted to I want to keep things very conversational. I have a PowerPoint. By no means do I want to treat this as like a formal presentation, because I know that all of us are very zoomed out. But full disclosure, when I went to undergrad, I never ever in my life imagined that I would become a professor. I never in my life imagined that I'd become a writer. I grew up in an immigrant family. My mother is a nurse. Surprise, surprise. My father worked an office job. I grew up in LA. And very much this idea of college was just this functional thing that, like, you go to college to get a good job. And when I went to undergrad, I was lost. I was very, very, very much lost. So I grew up in a community that was Filipino and Latinx, mostly my neighborhood, my school, the churches that my parents frequented, Filipino and Latinx. And then after having grown up in that environment where I was able to, like, on a daily basis, witness the vibrant connections between Filipino and Latinx communities, I went to an undergrad institution where I was one of 20 Filipinos in the entire class. And so I mentioned that because when I was, that first year was really tough. And I think, like, for those of us that grow up in predominantly POC communities, we know that talking about race and ethnicity, those are just everyday aspects of life. But when I moved from there to going to a predominantly white dormitory, predominantly white campus, also very wealthy campus, it was it was a very much a big culture shock. And it was there that I started to learn that there are people for whom talking about these issues of race, ethnicity, immigration, that those weren't everyday topics for them. And so it was often the case whenever I brought up issues of identity, I had classmates that said, why do you always have to bring up the Filipino thing? Why do you always have to bring up race? And I remember how traumatizing that was. And it wasn't until I met Dr. Don Mabalan, who at the time, again, was a graduate student there, that I learned that it is absolutely okay. And it's actually imperative on you to get in the habit of centering your experience as a Filipino American as the point of departure for you to think about these larger topics that are going on in society, from immigration to educational inequality to racial connections and racial conflict. There's a lot that centering Filipinos can teach the world. And even though there was nothing in my K-12 curriculum that and my college curriculum that told me you can do that, I learned very much so that my role models are often found not always in the institution, but actually in the community. So from her, I learned that you can actually build knowledge from people from your own community. So that is how this book came about. I very much went home to start writing this story. I wanted to write about the connections between Filipino and Latinx communities that are so apparent in a place like the Central Valley, but are not apparent to other parts of the world. And so yeah, that's how this all started. So I know that we have a mixed audience. There's going to be folks here who are pretty much adept at Filipino American studies. There are folks that may be new to this. And so I just wanted to talk broadly speaking about the book and the topics in general, Filipino American communities. I focus my conversation a lot on Los Angeles because that's where I grew up. But I've always wanted my writing to be a point of departure for folks to think about how race and identity function in your own respective spaces. I know we're going to have the chance for Q&A toward the last 15 minutes, and that's actually I'm really excited about that because I want to hear what your thoughts and reactions are to the book. So I wrote this book, The Latinos of Asia, because I was experiencing Asian American identity in a very different time. I remember as a Filipino American growing up in LA, there was this phenomenon where people, let's say you're describing your school, you would say, oh, in my school, I go to school with white folks, black folks, Asian folks, Latino folks, and Filipinos. So people would always, I grew up in an environment where folks would always list Filipinos as like a different category. And so for much of my life, I always saw Filipino and Asian as sort of two separate identities, even though much of the other parts of the country, perhaps the world, saw Filipinos as part of Asian American identity. And in this moment where we're seeing hashtags like hashtag stop Asian hate, hashtag stop AAPI hate, when we're seeing violence being enacted against everyone from Pakistani immigrants to Filipino immigrants to Chinese and Korean immigrants. We saw the incredibly violent, horrific acts of violence of white supremacy in Atlanta just a few weeks ago, and it's just the world is still grappling with that incident, that tragedy. This is a moment where people are starting to become very conscious of their Asian American identity. So regardless of whether you're from one country or the other, I think this is a moment. It's often violence that often leads folks to see what are the similarities between like the different Asian American groups. And I think that that sense of unity amongst different groups, it can fluctuate at different times. And that's what I was very much interested in studying. So just to give you some background on Filipino Americans. A lot of folks don't know this basic information, but there are 4 million Filipino Americans in the United States. And here I'm including both Filipino Americans who are undocumented as well as those with different forms of status. Filipinos are the second largest Asian group in the entire United States, especially like a lot of numbers. They do this thing where they tend to omit multiracial Asian Americans and don't count them as part of the group. But if you count multiracial Filipino Americans, it makes Filipinos the second largest Asian group in the country. Actually, in California, Filipinos are the largest Asian group in the country. But there's this peculiar thing where Filipinos are often, as Fred Cordova, one of the first Filipino American historians, who himself didn't have a PhD, he was a community historian. He talks about Filipinos as this forgotten Asian American. I just want to quickly look at the group that we have here collected in front of us. How many of you, just raise your hands or nod, how many of you ever heard this phenomenon of Filipinos as like the forgotten Asian Americans? Just like raise your hands. Or So I see a couple thumbs up and I see a couple hands go up. And so this was very common to me, especially growing up in LA, where when people mentioned the term Asian, they weren't often including Filipino Americans. They were often thinking of the other like East Asian categories, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. And so it just begged this question, like, are Filipino Americans really Asian? And I thought about this as this is kind of a silly research question, but it was a really useful one because I thought about how with Filipino Americans, if you read history books and you read about organizing history, you learn that in the 1960s and 70s, when people were coming up with this term Asian American, that was an activist identity, right? We often think of Asian as like a cultural identity or something that denotes food or a geography. But in its origins in the 1960s and 70s, Asian was very much a political identity. And our sensibility that Asian is a political identity has since been it's sort of faded away over time. But Asian is at its roots, it's a politicized identity when Chinese activists, Japanese American activists, and Filipino American activists decided to come together and say, hey, we don't have the critical mass as other people of color in the United States. Let's unite under this banner of Asian Americans so that we can advocate for civil rights, economic rights that we're being denied because of our race. So in the 1960s and 70s, Filipino Americans were part of that movement to create an Asian American identity. And from that moment, we had ethnic studies develop. We had Asian American student groups develop. We had Asian American organizing efforts develop in the community. We had Asian American publications. But since the 1960s, which is quite a ways ago, there's been this interesting rift that's developed between Filipino Americans and other Asian Americans. And I just want to tell a very quick story that's kind of a silly example, but it gets to the heart of how this rift can play out in everyday life. So, as you see in front of you, this is a picture of alcohol. And I just use this as a background. But when I was at UCLA, I remember being a broke graduate student, not with like negative $2 in my bank account, in my checking, and $0 in my saving account. I literally have a picture from my last year of grad school, me at the Wells Fargo, trying to pull out money from the ATM, and it says -2 and $0. This is not an atypical experience of people that are in school. We're often hustling paycheck to paycheck. I was one of those people. And so I remember when I was at UCLA, I was walking in the hallways of campus and I saw this ad for a research study that said alcohol study. Do you drink alcohol regularly? Are you Asian American? And I thought to myself, yes and yes. And I looked at, like, the thing that caught my attention was at the bottom right there, $215. I thought this is going to be the easiest 200 bucks that I'll make. And as I mentioned, I had like -$2 in my bank account. I really needed this money. So I gave a call to the study coordinator. I gave her my info, my availability, and everything was working out just fine until I mentioned that I was Filipino. And at that point, the researcher said, I'm sorry, we can't have you be part of the study because we can only have Chinese, Japanese, and Korean participants. And I thought to myself, that's weird because I had studied Asian American history, I studied sociology, I learned that like racial identity is a social construct. But this woman said we can only have those three groups because we need a genetically similar sample. And so here I was, having read for the past many, many years about Filipinos and their involvement in Asian American history. And I was now in the crossroads of this moment where someone, a non-Asian person, was telling me, you don't qualify, you're not Asian American. And so I got very upset. Besides losing the money, I just got upset that it was this moment where I realized this is something that Filipino Americans experience more often than not, where people assume that they're not Asian. So when you think about, you think this is like a little microcosm of what happens on a broader scale, I started to realize that like, this is something that happens to Filipino Americans a lot. They're excluded in medical studies on Asian Americans. They're excluded from media opportunities or political opportunities about Asian Americans. When it comes to, for example, television shows, I heard from a lot of Filipino American actors that when they go in to audition for Asian roles, white casting directors will say, "Well, you're not like Asian. You're like Latino day. Latino casting day is next week, right?" Like these are literally things that would get said to them. And so I wanted to really study whether these anecdotal moments that I was hearing about Filipinos were happening on a broader scale. And when I looked at research about Filipino Americans and other Asian Americans in LA, I learned, I saw like when people were asked that question, what is your racial background? It wasn't just other people telling Filipinos that they weren't Asian. There was also this trend of Filipinos themselves not seeing themselves as Asian. So when the researchers asked Filipinos and other Asians this question, what is your racial background? They found that 95% of Chinese, Vietnamese, Koreans say yes. Like they say Asian, they pick Asian American as their identity. But when it came to Filipino Americans, only 45% of Filipino Americans chose Asian as their racial background. And I wanted to really understand what on earth is going on. I know a lot of times, like, especially when I was trying to study this phenomenon in the early 2000s, it is now the year 2021. I can't believe I've been thinking about this for 20 years. But when I was trying to understand this phenomenon, a lot of people pushed back and they were like, oh, who cares? It's just identity. Like, what does it even matter? And I think that in this moment, we're starting to see why racial identity, especially for Asian Americans, matters because it affects which groups are able to access resources, which groups are able to have airtime. It's very much in our hands to control which groups are included and which groups are not. And so when I got to reading within the field of sociology, that's where I teach. I learned that when you think about race, it's not just a matter of checking a box on a form. When we think about race, it's an identity, it's a category that's comprised of a what black anthropologist John Jackson describes as a constellation of different factors. So if you think about something like the Big Dipper in the sky or the Little Dipper in the sky, that's like a picture that's made up of individual stars that literally draw out the Big or Little Dipper, right? Race is kind of functioning in the same way where we have to think about what people look like, of course, but there's other factors that come into play, like what religion folks are, hair texture, skin color, whether they can speak a particular language or not. All of those factors come into play for how we determine who is in which racial category. And what I was realizing is that the constellation of factors that help people determine whether people are Asian and the constellation of factors that help people determine whether someone's Latinx or Latino, with Filipinos, they're kind of like right smack in the middle because of the different cultural and historical influences going on. I realized that this is something that's very context dependent. So like in the city of Los Angeles, I remember I spoke with one Filipino American who said, you know what, my experience being Filipino, it's different depending where I'm at. If I'm in like Koreatown, people think I'm Asian. If I go to East LA, people think I'm Latina. So it's like race, as much as we think of it as a stable category, it can shift just depending on what part of the city you're in, let alone part of the country you're in. And one of the things that I also realized is that how people categorize you, as I've mentioned earlier, it can impact all sorts of things from the way you're treated, from the way your teachers interact with you, from the way your counselors interact with you, to the way jobs perceive you, to the way potential dating partners or friends perceive you. The way you read racially has tremendous impact on your life in more ways than we realize. And so what's going on with Filipino identity? I wanted to explore it. I myself am Filipino, so I had a hunch of what was going on, but as a researcher, it was super important for me to actually just sort of put a boundary on how I was feeling about things and put on my researcher hat and ask folks of different genders, of different regions in LA, of different age groups, and just ask them like, what does it mean to be Filipino? I asked them, do you feel like you're part of the Asian American community? I asked them, do you feel like you're, close to other groups that you live around? And I remember there was this one particular respondent. This is not a picture of her, it's just a representation of her because we have to keep our respondents anonymous. She used this phrase. She said, well, first I asked her, like, do you think Filipinos and Asians have a lot of similarities? And she said, actually, because of colonization, I feel, she's referring to Spanish colonialism and American colonialism. I feel like Filipinos have a lot more similarities with Latinos. It's hard to say we're Asian because we share so many cultural similarities with Latinos. And she ended that part of the conversation with saying Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is a catchphrase that I've been hearing my entire life. And here I was interacting with someone many years younger than me who was saying they grew up in a different part of LA that was saying the exact same thing. And what I realized is a lot of the people I interviewed and a lot of just like other folks of different ethnicities that I interact with, they would use this catchphrase, Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia, or Filipinos are like the Latin Asians or the Hispanic Asians. They would use some sort of like qualifier to say that Filipinos, yeah, they're Asian, but they're kind of also Latino. Before I keep going, I want to just sort of survey the room. And how many of you have ever heard some sort of like either explicit hinting or implicit hinting that Filipinos and Latinos share this like bond with each other? So I'm seeing a lot of the clapping emojis and thumbs up. Cool. So I'm not the only like what is great when you do these presentations in different cities is that again it shows that this sort of phenomenon is happening all the time everywhere. And we got to think to ourselves, what does it mean that like Filipinos technically belong to this racial category of Asian, but a lot of people in everyday life see them as Latino, right? If I don't know if you can see it, but like I have a picture of me and my partner up there. In that he made a little anniversary present for us. But when he is walking the streets, the first time he met my family, nobody thought he was Filipino. Everyone thought he was Mexican American because of like the way that he looks. Even when you look at childhood pictures of him, he said his entire experience in his schooling from kindergarten to 12th, it took many months before people realized he was Filipino. And even though that's like he's not technically checking the Latino box or the Hispanic box when he's in school, that experience of being perceived as Latino had very, very important implications on his social life, his academic life. And for me, it was worth highlighting those moments. And so we got to ask ourselves, how is it possible that like this group that comes from a set of islands in Asia, 7,000 miles away across the Pacific, why is it that they're being perceived as Latino? And a lot of it has to do with this long-standing impact of colonialism. I know that in our history books in elementary school, we often read about colonialism as something that's from the past or yesteryear. But when I was talking to Filipino Americans in everyday life in the current moment, I realized, holy moly, the impact of colonialism, it doesn't just end just because just because Spanish colonialism in the Philippines ended in 1898, just because American colonialism ended in 1946, technically, the impact of those historical moments still impacts our everyday lives today. So in the Philippines, there's I just put this little William Faulkner quote at the top of the slide. It says, "The past is not dead. It's not even past." Because I thought that was just a really great quote that underscores that like the things that happened in the past very much have implications for our present moment. And in front of you, this is this famous mural that was done by Eliseo Silva in Los Angeles. It's in historic Filipino town. And here I want you to focus particularly on the right above the word like source and the first author I cite, Choi. there's a gentleman there that I'm sure all of you recognize who that is. You just had a speaker by the name of Dolores Huerta, who worked very closely with this man in this photo. It's Cesar Chavez, who's obviously like someone that had a very close connection to the Central Valley. But Cesar Chavez and the two gentlemen that are behind him, Philip Veracruz and Larry Itliong, this is one of those examples where like Spanish colonialism of Filipinos and Mexican Americans provided a little bit of a backdrop for Filipinos and Mexican Americans of the contemporary moment to see, oh my gosh, there's more similarities between us than differences. And you know, as most of you have heard or read about, the United Farm Workers was this, I guess you could think, if you think about the Spanish colonialism as the backdrop, having colonized both Mexico and the Philippines, actually that period, during that period, it was mostly Philippine colonialism. Like the colonization of the Philippines was actually operated through Mexico, not so much Spain. So the connection between Filipinos and Mexicans are actually much stronger than, you know, Spanish colonialism would imply, because everything was happening via events like the ruling parties in Mexico. So anyway, that is no accident that then you had a social movement that was very much interconnected between Filipinos and Mexican Americans. That is no accident. And so I think that the signs that you see in front of you, in front of Cesar Chavez, Larry Leong, and Philip Veracruz, you see the words huelga, which you all can translate to the word strike. And in Tagalog, for example, the word strike is huelga. In Spanish, the word is huelga, right? So there's this slang in the Philippines that Filipinos spent 300 years in the convent, referring to the Spanish colonial period, and 50 years in Hollywood, referring to the American colonial period. And both of these historical events, like, they have long-standing impact on the way Filipino Americans navigate their everyday lives, particularly in regions of the country where you have a high number of Latinx folks. And so throughout the book, what I do is I try to break down the particular arenas of everyday life. I'm really interested in everyday folks. I'm not interested in always interviewing people that are like the, like, quote unquote, the leaders or the representatives of a community. I really, really just love doing research on everyday communities, everyday folks. And what I realized is that this connection between Filipinos and Latinos, it appeared in four different arenas of people's social lives. It appeared in the way people talked about phenotype, like what they look like. So Filipinos would say things like, "Oh, you know, we have it's hard to pin down who Filipinos are because we have such like a diverse set of looks." That's what one person said. Or they would say things like, when people first meet me, they assume that I'm Mexican American because of the way, like, my skin color or the way I look or the way I carry myself. They assume I'm Mexican American. I've heard this from both Filipino American men and Filipino American women. And that, you don't, when you interact with people, it's not always the case that you have conversations with them, right? And so it's important to understand that, like, Filipinos racially, they have such a diverse experiences. Some converge with Latinos and some converge with Asian Americans. With respect to language, this is something that a lot of Filipinos mentioned a lot. They say things like, growing up in LA, it was very obvious to see that, like, Filipinos and Mexican Americans or other Latinos had similarities in their language, right? In everyday words. When you think about everyday words in Spanish, like if I think about what I write on right here, this is some mesa. In Tagalog, in Spanish, it's the same word, mesa. If I think about what I'm wearing on the upper half of my body, this is camiseta. If I think about shoes, zapatos. If I think in Filipino, the way we describe this thing I'm sitting on is a silla. In Spanish, it's silla. So it's not, even though there's a lot of variances between Filipino languages and the Spanish language, the fact that there were overlapping words was the starting point for Filipinos to wonder, what on earth is this thing where like we have similar words in Spanish and Tagalog? It sort of raised their consciousness of the fact that we have, like, Filipinos and Mexicans have a shared history by way of colonialism. In addition to actual words, part of language is naming, right? And so my last name is Ocampo. My partner's, one of his last names is Velasco. In my family, we have last names like Torres, Rodriguez, um, Garcia, Gonzalez. And those are all examples of last name. If you were to ask people, just like walking down the street, tell me the identity of someone with the last name Gonzalez or Garcia or Ocampo. 9 times out of 10, they're actually 99.95 times out of 100. They're probably going to say that person is Latina, Latino, Latinx, and they're likely not going to say that person is Asian, right? Now think about that same phenomenon. If you're an employer, you're just looking through applications and resumes, and you see someone by the name of like Andrew Rodriguez, right? You're going to assume that person is Latino, not Filipino, even though Andrew Rodriguez is a very, I know at least 3 Filipino Andrew Rodriguezes. So the point is, language, you can see, plays a huge role in how people categorize others by race. And that's another moment where we see the impact of Spanish colonialism affecting Filipino Americans. Religion is an obvious arena too. Like, a large chunk of Filipino Americans are Catholic, a large chunk of Latinos are Catholic. And you think about the church, the Catholic Church, even though not everybody goes to church or was raised in the church, it still provides a very important organizing mechanism for linking communities with each other and putting all these things together: phenotype, language, religion. It affects also the networks that Filipino Americans have. So one of the interesting findings that I saw with Filipino Americans is that when you ask them who they in the world of sociology, people are really interested in like whether people marry someone of the same ethnicity or race, versus someone of a different race, like this concept of like interracial marriage. And what researchers data has showed is that with Filipino Americans, about 20 to 25% of Filipinos partner with someone who is Latinx. And that number is much larger than for other Asian American groups. Research studies showed that only about 1 to 3% of other Asian groups partner with someone that is Latinx. So when you look at the percentages of Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean Americans, only about 1 to 3% of those groups marry someone who's Latino or Latina or Latinx. In contrast with Filipinos, it's about 20-25%. Now, I mentioned that because the reason that the numbers are so different is because when you think about the nuances of romantic relationships, who do we tend to partner with and date? We tend to partner with and date folks that have very overlapping sort of networks, overlapping cultural experiences. So those numbers indicate that Filipinos' cultural experiences have somewhat of more overlap with Latinos than other Asian Americans. In fact, what was interesting is that Filipinos were twice as likely to partner with someone that was Latinx than they were to partner with someone who was Asian American, which I thought to be really interesting. So I kind of just gave you a quick summary of the main findings of the book. But what I wanted to do was just sort of talk about how these things matter. So a couple of years ago, there was this Filipino American undocumented person by the name of Jose Antonio Vargas. And I like closing my talks by talking about him because he's an example of someone who, you know, is really been an advocate for immigration, has been talking about his status as an undocumented person, a documented American for years. And overwhelmingly, people that don't know much about Jose assume that he's Mexican. In fact, people on the like right that are super racist, they often will like slide into his DMs or email him like hate mail that say, go back to Mexico. And to Jose's credit, he gets this sort of hate comment so much that he ends up jesting with them. He said, I remember one time on Twitter, he was like, "Oh, I'd love to go to Mexico, but I can't because I don't have papers. I have so many friends from Mexico. I would love to go to Mexico, but unfortunately, because I don't have legal status, I can't travel to Mexico." Which is just like his like humorous way of like counteracting the racist experiences that he gets, because people assume that he's Mexican. They assume anyone that's undocumented is from Mexico. And I think that Jose's story really underscores this idea that like Filipinos' racial experiences cannot be encapsulated by just one category. And I think that's the case with everybody. Like we can't sort of just assume that just because people belong to a certain box that their experience is going to be the same as everyone else. And even though I'm talking mostly today about Filipino Americans, we see how that it's important to break the scripts for what we understand to be Asian experiences, what we understand to be Latino experiences, what it means to be the Black experience, right? Indigenous experiences, Muslim experiences, because not all of those, like that category cannot encapsulate the heterogeneity or the diversity of experiences that are occurring within that broader community. So, if anything, I like to think of Filipinos as like just the way to like disrupt the way people think about race. Of course, as a Filipino, I care that people learn about our community, but I think Filipinos have this really important lesson that we can't just assume that people in those categories all have the same experiences. Even thinking about what happened, just to bring it back to the anti-Asian violence of today, we have to be very specific about what happened in Atlanta. This was a case where it was mostly Asian women, immigrant, in a particular line of work that's associated, that's sexualized, and in a particular line of work that's associated in the service sector, right? That's a very unique Asian experience compared to say like an Asian American engineer that works in the Silicon Valley, right? And so I just want to use my research as a nudge to get people to think about how we can complicate our understanding of the categories that we tend to use in everyday life in oversimplified ways. So with that, I just wanted to close my chatting, like my part of the. I know I'm like been talking a lot. I definitely want to transition to conversation. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time. I know how things are so busy right now, particularly this time in year. So I'm just really thrilled to be in this being community with you. So it's just really cathartic to be able to talk about these topics. Because I mean, when I first started doing this work, it felt like nobody really cared. And so the fact that you're all here listening, it really just, on a personal level, just means so much. Because I spent most of my career feeling like it would never matter to anyone. So thank you. And for anyone that's thinking about becoming a writer or storyteller, because you don't see your story out there, I highly encourage you to do that. So
Well, thank you so much, Anthony and Dr. Ocampo. It was really appreciated. We do have some questions coming through in the chat, and so I'm actually going to turn it over to one of our English instructors, Vaughn Torres, for the first question. Vaughn, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ocampo, for your presentation today. We indirectly know each other. Like I was in Bonds in New York, 2016, when you're both.
Oh my goodness.
And I went to SF State, so I know Manam Don, and I was part of PEP, and so.
Awesome. I have this shirt too.
Yeah. And so, yeah, just thank you for just being here. How exciting that we get to have you for this past hour. And my question for you was, at Clovis Community College, we currently don't offer ethnic studies courses. And I'm just wondering, could you share why ethnic studies is important for community college students today?
Oh my good. Yeah. I would have left the college that I was at had it not been for ethnic studies, to be honest. I tried all different classes. Like I always thought I was a smart kid, but like I always thought like learning was I reached ethnic studies, I always thought learning was you pick up a book and you read about people that tell you something that you need to learn, whether it's in science or history. Um, and like they're the ones who are experts on what you're trying to learn. Howard Zinn is the person that teaches you about history, or I don't know anything about science, but like, you know, it, I just felt like that was my orientation toward knowledge consumption. And then I realized in ethnic studies, that was the first time I was in a space where, at least since like elementary school or something, where you do like projects on your family. Ethnic studies was the first space where I realized, I'm sorry, I'm gonna say oh shit. Like literally, I was like, oh shit, like the fact that my mom spent 6 nights out of the week not sleeping at home because she was staying with in the richer side of LA, caring for a wealthy white woman while me and my dad were by ourselves on the east side of LA. That was no accident. That's like a phenomenon that happens with Filipino American immigrants all the time, where they're not all in the same household. The fact that that I had a multi-generational household where we heard Tagalog and English sort of like seamlessly blending with each other, that's something that was worth studying, because being exposed to multiple languages isn't just good for your like cultural sensibilities, it's good for your cognitive development. That's something I learned from like an ethnic studies class in education. What I was experiencing in my undergraduate career, where I felt like if I don't do well on an exam, that's not just gonna reflect poorly on me, that's gonna reflect poorly on every single Filipino that comes after me. I learned that was a type of stress. Like the only reason I learned that was a type of racial stress was because I took an African American psychology class where we learned about stereotype threat. I took many other psychology classes where we never learned about that. It was sort of just like what you experience as an individual phenomenon. And so, besides being integral to ensuring that I didn't quit, I think that ethnic studies has been a space where I got to get my legs under me as a writer, as a thinker. And it took what I learned was that it took years for me to realize that talking about my Filipino-ness wasn't just important for me, it was important for other Filipinos, but it was also important for the world. When everything in my education had done the opposite. Everything in my education experience up to that point had told me that your differences, you being Filipino, nowadays you being queer, that has no place in classroom discussion. That has no place in books. That's what I was sort of subconsciously ingrained to think. And it wasn't until I took a variety of different ethnic studies classes that I felt more empowered to take up space and inject my whatever I was thinking about the world. I think that like young people of color are doing this type of like injecting their own ideas through a variety. It doesn't have to be in school. It could like in music, in art, in activism, and on social media. If you think about some of the best television on communities of color, the work that is doing the most revolutionary stuff when it comes to telling stories about people of color, it's interesting to see that a lot of those folks were ethnic studies majors in college. So a show like Insecure, which is doing wonders for altering the way we think about Black communities in LA, she was an African American studies major. When I think about folks like Randall Park or like Ali Wong, people that are providing texture to what it means to be Asian American, they were Asian American studies students at one point. So I think that like if you want to, I just think it's so necessary. And for people that are not folks of color, I think that those courses are necessary because like it's not doing anyone a service to to ignore the fact that our society is shaped by race and racism. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ocampo. The next question will be from one of our student success coaches, Kizzy Lopez. I'm going to go ahead and unmute yourself, Kizzy.
Hi, Dr. Ocampo. Thank you for virtually coming to Clovis Community College and your presentation today. You know, my experience is I am Filipina, but socially I identify as a Black woman because of the way that I look, right? And so when I had the opportunity to take my mom, I saw Filipinos that looked like me, that people. So my mom called them mountain people. And at first I was really excited to see Filipinos that look like me, because the conversation we're having today is talking a lot about Filipinos that look Latino, which large population, but then there's also Filipinos that look like me.
Absolutely.
That are a lot of times not talked about. And also when I went to the Philippines and saw the Ita people that look like me, I was devastated to find out that they're also marginalized. So to have this kind of dual experience, to be marginalized here in this country, that also in the Philippines of my own heritage, can you talk a little bit about the anti-Blackness that exists in our culture?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You know, I think anti-Black, like from the moment that there was contact between the Philippines and the United States, anti-Blackness played a key role there. So whenever Filipinos were depicted in American media, they were sort of like, how do we portray these people? And it was often using anti-Black as well as anti-Indigenous caricatures to describe what Filipinos are. And I think that given that the American education system is the one that penetrated the Philippines, it's no accident that the anti-Blackness has sort of embedded itself in the way the Philippines is organized today. So if we think about colorism in the Philippines, if we think about the way that inequality, like there's regional inequality that often correlates with like indigenous groups in the Philippines, from Igorot to Eta, all of those groups experience they're severely under resourced. They're in positions where their cultural practices are in danger of being appropriated or let's just say stolen, like stolen, land being stolen. That's a serious phenomenon that's happening in the Philippines that needs to be addressed. But because oftentimes our conception of the Philippines is based entirely on Manila, like the city center, it ignores the many different indigenous communities that are going on there, and the degree to which indigenous folks become relevant in Philippine, like sort of like mainstream Filipino culture. It's very selective, right? There's like, oh, we can do these indigenous dances, but let's like ignore what's actually going on in the Philippines. So to the credit of a lot of there's a lot of people whose migration roots are from the Philippines that are identifying more closely or sort of amplifying indigenous identity, indigenous issues. There's emerging like students, activists, PhD students that are centering the indigenous experiences because they see how the concept of Filipino, that in and of itself can ignore a lot of stuff. So I'm trying to think of the equivalent. So if you think about, for example, our conception of Mexican American is not necessarily based on indigenous groups in Mexico or Afro Mexicanos either. It's based on a particular concept of like mestizaje. I think there's a similar danger going on with Filipinos where we conceptualize Filipinos based on like people from the province that go to Manila and then people from Manila that come to the United States, right? In fact, it's a super diverse country that, and I do think that, like, I even looking back at my book, which I wrote 5 years ago, one of the things that I feel like I need to do a better job is who are the Filipinos that are exploring, expanding knowledge on indigenous aspects of Filipino identity in a way that's not sort of cultural appropriation, if you will. But I think what Kizzy, what I love about what you said is that I think some of the best scholarship and storytelling happens when you have these multiple frames of reference, right? You mentioned that as a Filipino woman that identifies as a Black woman, but then going to the Philippines and seeing the inequality, like you're equipped with a certain lens that few people are equipped with, and whatever knowledge is produced from that particular intellectual perspective, that's going to be so important, so that like a work like mine is in conversation with the writing and stuff and the story that you produce, because we need both. We it's necessary to have both in order to have a conversation that advances and doesn't just stay stagnant and like, I want my book to become obsolete very fast. And I think that it's stories like yours that can help get to that point, you know?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo. We're going just a little bit over time, if that's okay, but we do have a couple of more questions.
Yes, sure.
To get to the next question comes from Melissa Flores. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Hi, thank you. Hi, good morning, everybody. Dr. Ocampo, I just want to say a big salamat from all of us in the Central Valley. I know personally, I grew up in a very white area. I'm from Arkansas. And so as soon as, college applications hit, I was looking at West Coast schools. I went to Davis and immediately joined the Filipino interest sorority. So, rest in power to Dr. Don and Ate Gail Ramasanta and all the fantastic work by Little Manila Rising. I'm kind of shaking because I'm really like in awe that you're even here presenting. And I also want to preface this by saying thank you to our team at Clovis for providing this opportunity. And also being here in Fresno in the Central Valley for just over a decade, I have noticed and observed that there's not a very widespread population of Filipinos here. And so my personal experience is when I see one in public, my husband and I, who is, newly like a citizen of the US as of 2005 from the Philippines, we see a Filipino in the distance and we're like, oh my God, there's a Filipino over there. So it's a very rare occurrence for me to see a Filipino in general here, but to have this platform to talk on it and learn more. That was very long. I want to be sensitive about time too. Sorry about that, Patrick. So my question is this. I mean, it ties into colonialism, the white ideal, Asian American studies and ethnic studies. I know that in terms of ethnic studies, I'm going back to Vaughn's question, just as a stats, share for everyone, 9 community colleges, and I'm specifically looking at within the California community college system, only 9 community colleges provide ethnic studies, and only 5 provide Asian American studies. And so this is a very, very, very small, like I can't speak more on this. I could, it's just such a valuable thing that we see so little of. So my question is, what allies within the Central Valley and within California in a more broad sense can we build relationships with here to make sure that this conversation continues?
Oh, that's such an important question. I'm just thinking about the movement that's happening at City College of San Francisco, which had one of the most robust Filipino American studies curriculum, and all of a sudden it's in danger, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's one of the few of any institution of higher ed to have it. Gosh, I think that one of the things, when we think about the history of ethnic studies, a lot of it has been organizers, right? With student organizers, faculty organizers, other sort of scholar organizers that have agitated in order to get that going. I also work at the Cal State University Chancellor's Office, where I get to see that there are people that are in a position to really make some moves with ethnic studies, but aren't the same people that are agitating on the ground for ethnic studies. And so I wonder, to full disclosure, Melissa, I'm still like grappling with to what extent like how do we is bridge building even possible between like white administrators that may not sort of see the same things that like ethnic studies organizers and communities are seeing? I still don't know the answer to that question, because what I see is often like a lot of conflict. What I do know is that like ethnic studies is super important. I know that there are many PhD graduates from various institutions across the country who are unable to secure tenure track jobs that would be excellent people on an organizational front and a scholarly front to build vibrant departments of ethnic studies, not just in California, but elsewhere. And I'm just thinking like, how do we have all of these amazing ethnic studies thinkers all over the country that can't get faculty jobs? That would be like in theory, couldn't they be like launch departments in the many community colleges in California and elsewhere to like create these robust ethnic studies programs that not only prepare people to pursue that in college, but regardless of what students study, whether they go to engineering or whether they go into design, like that knowledge is going to be so important anyway. So like, why not just launch these programs? That's my oversimplified thinking about it. Because I think the seed that ethnic studies plants in people is just, you just never know. Like my entire career is built off one-on-one interactions that I had in ethnic studies context. Had those interactions not happened, I would not be where I am today. I can very confidently say that. So I think about, you said UC Davis. There's a thing called the Bulasan Center, which I think folks should know about. That was launched by a scholar by the name of Robin Rodriguez, close friends with Don Mabalan, like girlfriends, like they're close friends. When I wanted to quit academia, those were the women that would pull me aside and say, "You can't quit. You got to do this." And that was them. They weren't even my professors. They just took it upon themselves to be the professor in my life that got me not to quit. And I think about how many times I've grabbed coffee or I've grabbed lunch with people like Robin and Don, and how those were predicated on the fact that we were in the same intellectual space, and how those were moments where we were able to talk scholarship, methodology, activism, immigrant life, queer life in one convo. And those are the type of convos I never have with professors in my other departments or teachers. And I model myself after those folks, and I think that that's been a good for my students and for the communities I come into contact with. So I just think like, why isn't that type of intellectual community more accessible? I wish it was. So, and I think given that like students of color, low income students, undocumented students, community colleges are often their first point of contact for like, it'd be great if those were just all around, you know?
Thank you, Dr. Ocampo. We are going to go to one more question from JC014. At least that's what the username says. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you right now. This will be the last question.
Hi, Dr. Campo. I enjoyed your presentation, and my question is kind of like this. You sound like a American-born Filipino, and so when you went to the Philippines, your homeland, can you describe your experience and thoughts? Because I think you think a lot about things, so this is a very interesting question for me.
Of course. Thank you for asking that. JC,
John Cho.
John Cho. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've never, it's funny, for all the talks I've done, I've never been asked this question about like, what's it like for me to, it's such an important question because I think in this country, I'm kind of like developing this identity as a Filipino, someone that knows a lot about the Filipino experience. But man, that totally disappears the moment I step into the Philippines. I've been to the Philippines. I used to go every year. Not every year, every few years when I was a kid. First time for sad reasons because family members passed away. But more recently, I was able to do like research projects there. How do I feel? Sometimes I feel a lot of things. I feel like sometimes I'm like, why did my parents migrate? We should just stayed here. I think about that, especially with all the like anti-Asian hate stuff. Sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe we should have stayed. I mean, that's just like an honest like. How can you not think that, right? Number two, I think about, wow, what a rich the country is obviously economically struggling, but like what a rich cultural, like there's so much richness in the country culturally, musically, artistically. And I think about like what the possibilities in that country are endless if it wasn't for the tremendous devastation that American colonialism, other colonial things brought to the Philippines. I just think like what brilliance, like the brilliance that could emerge if this country was allowed the resources and the space to flourish. And that makes me sad, that makes me sad a lot of the times. But I also think like I kind of every time I go to the Philippines, I prefer to be a student because as someone that's never lived in the Philippines, it's just really important for me to just absorb and absorb and absorb, not in any sort of like, not for any purpose, but just to take it all in. And every time I go to the Philippines, I come back and I just sort of want to see what that experience has done to me for the way I look at the world. And I think the consistent feeling that I get every time I come back is number one, I'm like, wow, my body feels a lot less stressed because like everyone looks like me, and how much stress is imposed on my body when I live in spaces where I am the different one. Number two, I just think like I have such an opportunity here in the United States because of the schooling and platform I have. In what ways can in what ways can I be, people can use me, or like I can be of use to people there, or I just think about in what way can I be of service to folks that don't have the same access to platforms that I do. That's not the perfect answer, but I would love to have a life where I regularly go to the Philippines and go home. Like the verb, it would be wonderful. I just life wise, it's difficult to do because we're so busy, but I hope to carve that out in the future.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Dr. Ocampo, thank you so much for joining us virtually. And thank you also for the knowledge that you've shared, the research. I really want to encourage folks, if you have not had a chance to read Dr. Ocampo's book, please do so. It goes into a lot more detail with some of the information that he's shared with us today. Also, thank you to our colleagues at our other colleges that have joined us. I see a lot of fam from Fresno City and Reedley, and so thank you for being here. And to our Clovis Community College family, who's always been so supportive of our social justice series speakers. It's wonderful to see that continued support. And I'm also noticing that we've got quite a few students here. So Dr. Ocampo, thank you again for being here. And we hope that everyone else enjoys the rest of your day. And also wanted to give one final thank you to Patrick for helping us put this together. Patrick, thank you very, very much. I know we had a lot of adjusting to do with schedules and calendars, but we made it possible. So great work. Thank you again, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.